That's not your parking spot! My voice cut through the morning air like a shovel hitting hard ground. She turned toward me, still holding the keys to the gleaming Cadillac that had just parked on my property for the 7th time. The sun blazed overhead. The smell of fresh grass crushed under tire tracks drifted up from the lawn I had maintained for 3 years. She still did not know about property boundaries, but by the end of this week, she would know exactly where my line was and why she could never cross it again. Comment below where you are watching from and what you would do if someone blocked your driveway every single day. It started 7 days ago. I woke up at 6:30 a.m. on a Saturday to the sound of an engine idling too close to my bedroom window. When I looked outside, there it was, a silver Cadillac Escalade parked directly on the grass strip between my driveway and the front porch. Not on the street, not on the public easement, on my property. The woman behind the wheel was scrolling through her phone like she owned the place. I did not recognize her at first, but when she stepped out wearing a blazer with an HOA pin on the lapel, I knew exactly who she was. Constance Fairchild, the Homeowners Association president, the woman who had sent me 3 notices in the past year about my mailbox color, my fence height, and the type of flowers I planted in my own front yard. I walked outside in my work boots and knocked on her window before she could lock the car. She rolled it down halfway, barely glancing at me. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my tone steady. "You are parked on my property." She looked at me like I had just asked her to solve a calculus equation. "This is HOA common space," she said, waving one manicured hand toward my lawn. "I am conducting a site inspection for upcoming community improvements." I felt my pulse quicken, but kept my voice level. "This is not HOA property. This is my lot. I have the deed." She gave me a dismissive flick of her wrist and turned back to her phone. "You should check your plat map," she said without looking up. "This entire block falls under HOA jurisdiction. I will be done in 20 minutes. Then she rolled the window back up. I stood there for a moment, stunned. Not because I believed her. I knew exactly where my property line was. I had checked it 3 times when I bought the house 5 years ago, specifically to make sure I was outside the HOA boundary. My lot was grandfathered in, exempt from their rules. But she did not care. She had decided this was her space, and she was taking it. I went back inside, pulled up my property survey on my laptop, and printed it out. When I returned, her car was gone. The grass where she had parked was torn up. 2 deep ruts cutting through the soil I had spent months leveling and seeding. I took photos. I did not know why yet, but something told me I would need them. The next morning, Constance was back. Same spot, same time, 6:30 a.m. This time, I did not bother with conversation. I stood in front of her car with the survey document held high. She honked twice, then rolled down her window and leaned out. "Move," she said, not asked. "I have meetings all morning." I held my ground. "This paper proves my property line. You are trespassing." She glanced at the document for half a second, then shrugged. "I have been parking here for community business for over a year," she said, as if repetition made it true. "If you have a problem, file a complaint with the HOA board." Then she revved the engine just enough to make me step aside. I did, but I also took another photo, this time with her license plate in the frame. By day 3, she stopped pretending to have a reason. She just parked, got out, and walked away without a word. By day 4, the grass was completely destroyed, and I found a printed notice taped to my front door. It claimed I violated HOA landscaping standards due to unsightly lawn damage caused by improper maintenance. The audacity was breathtaking. She had wrecked my property and was now threatening to fine me for it. I felt my hands shake as I read it. Not from fear, from clarity. This was not about parking. This was about control. She believed that because she held a title, she could do whatever she wanted. And maybe, in her mind, she had done this before and gotten away with it. I called a lawyer that afternoon. He listened to my story, reviewed my deed, and confirmed what I already knew: my property was exempt from HOA authority. "But here's the thing," he said. "Fighting them in court will cost you thousands and take months. If you want to stop her, you need to make it physically impossible for her to park there." That night, I sat at my kitchen table and sketched out a plan. 4 concrete blocks. Each one weighs 4 tons, positioned exactly where she liked to park. She could threaten me with fake violations. She could pretend my property was hers, but she could not move 4 tons of concrete, not without a crane. And by the time she tried, everyone in this neighborhood would know exactly what kind of person Constance Fairchild really was. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. It was a 30-minute trip, but I needed more than just my property survey. I needed every document that proved where my land began and where the HOA authority ended. The clerk behind the counter was an older man with reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. He pulled up my address on his computer and printed out 3 maps, the original plat from 1978, the subdivision boundary from 2003, and my current deed with the legal description. He laid them side by side on the counter and tapped the boundary line with his pen. "See this," he said. "Your lot was part of the original farm parcel before the HOA subdivision was created. You are grandfathered in. They have no jurisdiction over your property." I asked him to certify the documents. He stamped each one with the county seal and handed them back in a manila folder. I thanked him and left. Now I had proof that could not be argued away. When I got home, the Cadillac was already there. Day 8. I did not bother confronting Constance this time. Instead, I took the folder inside and started researching construction regulations. I spent 3 hours reading county codes. The rules were clear. Any structure under 6 feet in height and not attached to a foundation did not require a building permit as long as it remained on private land. Concrete blocks would qualify. I pulled up supplier websites and started pricing materials. 2 tons of cement, 4 tons of sand, 6 tons of gravel. The total came to just under $1,200. I could afford that. What I could not afford was another month of her tearing up my lawn and pretending she had the right to do it. I called a concrete supplier and ordered everything for delivery on Saturday morning at 7 a.m. I also rented an industrial mixer and a vibrating compactor. When I stopped at the hardware store for wooden forms, rebar, and plastic sheeting, the pieces of my plan finally started to feel real. That afternoon, I measured the exact spot where she parked every morning. I marked 4 positions with spray paint, each one 5 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2.5 feet tall. Once filled, 4 tons per block, 16 tons total, immovable without heavy equipment. That night, she escalated. I found a letter in my mailbox on HOA letterhead. It was addressed to me and signed by Constance Fairchild as president. The letter stated that I violated Section 12.4 of the HOA guidelines, which required all residents to maintain aesthetically pleasing front yard landscaping free from damage or neglect. It went on to say that my lawn showed significant deterioration due to improper care, and that I had 14 days to restore it or face a fine of $50 per day. I read it twice, then a third time, slower, because I could not believe the audacity. She had caused the damage. She had ignored my warnings, and now she was threatening to fine me for it. I sat down at my kitchen table and drafted a response. I kept it short and factual. I stated that my property was not subject to HOA regulations, that I had certified documents proving this, and that the damage to my lawn was caused by repeated trespassing by an HOA officer. I attached copies of the county records and the photos I had taken. I printed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and walked it directly to her mailbox. The next morning, Constance did not park on my lawn. For a moment, I thought maybe the letter had worked. Maybe she had finally realized she was in the wrong. But then I saw her car idling at the end of the block. She was sitting inside, talking on her phone. I could see her gesturing with one hand, animated, frustrated. 10 minutes later, a man in a suit pulled up in a black sedan. He got out, shook her hand, and they stood on the sidewalk talking for another 5 minutes. I could not hear what they were saying, but I recognized the body language. She was hiring someone, a lawyer, probably, or maybe something worse. Either way, she was not backing down. She was digging in. That was when I knew for certain that this was not just about parking. This was about something bigger. She had a reason for wanting access to this exact spot, and whatever that reason was, it was worth fighting for. I went back inside and pulled up public records for recent development projects in the area. It took me 20 minutes of searching, but I found it a proposal submitted 4 months ago by a private development company to widen the main road and add a turning lane. The proposed route cut directly through the edge of my property, The project was still in the planning phase, pending approval from the county and cooperation from affected landowners. I clicked through the attached documents and found a site map. There, marked in red, was the exact location where Constance had been parking. It was a survey point, a reference marker for the engineering team. My chest tightened. Suddenly, everything made sense. She was not just being petty. She was positioning herself for a payout. If the project moved forward and I agreed to sell or grant an easement, someone stood to make a serious commission, and she was making sure she had access to the one spot the developers needed most. I printed the development proposal and added it to my growing folder of evidence. Then I checked the HOA bylaws. There was a section that required the board president to disclose any financial interest in projects affecting the community. If Constance was working with the developer and had not disclosed it, that was a violation, a serious one. I made a note to follow up on that later. For now, I had concrete to pour. Saturday was 2 days away, and I needed to be ready. I sketched out the final design on graph paper, 4 blocks, each positioned to cover the tire tracks she had left behind. They would sit flush with the ground, anchored by their own weight, and completely legal. She could call the county, she could call her lawyer, she could call anyone she wanted, but she could not call a tow truck, because once those blocks were set, they were not going anywhere, and neither was I. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a chill that made the air feel sharp. The concrete truck pulled up at 7 a.m., right on schedule. The driver asked where I wanted the materials dumped. I pointed to the 4 spray-painted rectangles on my lawn. He nodded, backed the truck up, and unloaded 2 tons of cement, 4 tons of sand, and 6 tons of gravel in neat piles along the edge of my driveway. The sound of the aggregate hitting the ground was satisfying, like the first tangible step towards something I could control. I signed his delivery slip, and he drove off without asking questions. By 7:30 a.m., I had the wooden forms laid out and the rebar cut to size. I worked quickly, measuring twice before securing each piece. The morning sun climbed higher, and sweat started to soak through my shirt. By 9 a.m., the frames were ready. I mixed the first batch of concrete in the rented mixer, adding water slowly until the consistency looked right. Thick, but pourable. I filled the first form, using a vibrating compactor to eliminate air pockets. The process was repetitive and physical, but I found a rhythm in it. Shovel, pour, compact, smooth. The smell of wet cement hung in the air, earthy and industrial. Halfway through the second block, I heard a car door slam. I looked up and saw Constance striding across the street toward me, heels clicking against the pavement. She stopped at the edge of my property and stared at the forms, her expression shifting from confusion to fury in the span of 2 seconds. "What do you think you are doing?" she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I set down my shovel and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Building on my property," I said. She took a step closer, pointing at the forms. "This is obstruction," she said. "I will have my lawyer contact you." I met her eyes. "Good. Make sure he reads the property deed first." Her face flushed, and for a moment I thought she might actually step onto the wet concrete. Instead, she pulled out her phone, took several photos, and turned on her heel without another word. I watched her drive away, then went back to work. By noon, all 4 blocks were poured. I covered them with plastic sheeting and sprayed them down with water to help the curing process. Each block weighed just over 4 tons, 16 tons total, spread across the exact spots where her tires had been tearing up my grass. I stood back and looked at them, solid and immovable, and felt something settle in my chest. She could not move these, not without hiring a crane, which would cost her thousands of dollars and require my permission to access my property. I had turned her arrogance into an engineering problem she could not solve. Over the next 7 days, I followed the curing protocol. I watered the blocks 3 times a day to keep the concrete from cracking. On day 7, I removed the wooden forms. The blocks sat there, gray and unyielding, like ancient stones that had always been part of the landscape. Constance did not come back, but I knew she had not given up. On day 9, I received a certified letter from a law firm downtown. It was 3 pages long and full of legal jargon, but the message was clear. I was being threatened with a lawsuit for willful obstruction of vehicular access and violation of community standards. The letter demanded that I remove the blocks within 14 days or face legal action. I read it carefully, then filed it in my growing folder of evidence. She was escalating, just as I knew she would, but she had made a mistake. She had put her threats in writing. That same afternoon, I went back to the Public Records Office and requested copies of all correspondence related to the road expansion project. The clerk handed me a stack of documents that included meeting minutes, engineering reports, and email exchanges between the county planning department, the development company, and the HOA board. I took the stack home and spent 2 hours going through every page. In one email thread, the developer explicitly referenced needing access to Survey Point Alpha on my property for preliminary engineering assessments. In another message, someone from the HOA, using an official board email address that matched Constance's position, had replied, "Access secured, no issues anticipated." There it was. She had promised them access to my land without ever asking me. She had been parking there to establish a pattern, to make it look like the spot was communal space. If the project moved forward, she could claim my property had been in de facto public use, which might pressure me into selling or granting an easement. And somewhere in that deal, I was certain, there was money involved, a commission, a finder's fee, something that made this worth her time and her reputation. I printed everything and added it to my folder. Then I pulled up the HOA bylaws and found the section on financial disclosure. It was clear any board member with a financial interest in a project affecting the community had to disclose that interest in writing within 30 days. Constance had not disclosed anything. That was a breach of fiduciary duty. It was grounds for removal. More importantly, it was something the entire community had a right to know. I checked the calendar. The next monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks from today. It was open to all residents, and any member could request time to speak. I drafted a formal request and emailed it to the board secretary that evening. By the time the meeting rolled around, I would have everything I needed. The blocks were not going anywhere, and neither was the truth. The next 2 weeks were quiet, too quiet. The Cadillac never returned to my lawn, and the concrete blocks sat undisturbed, slowly weathering into the landscape. I expected Constance to make another move, but nothing came. No letters, no phone calls, no lawyers showing up at my door. It felt like the calm before a storm, and I used that time to prepare. I went through every piece of evidence I had collected: the photos of the tire tracks, the certified property documents, the emails from the development project, the threatening letters. I organized everything into a binder with labeled tabs. If I was going to speak at the HOA meeting, I needed to be airtight. No gaps, no assumptions, just facts. Then, on a Tuesday morning, I woke up to find my name on a neighborhood message board. Someone had posted a complaint about my property, calling the concrete blocks an eyesore and a safety hazard. The post accused me of being uncooperative and a detriment to property values. It was not signed, but the language matched hers exactly. Within hours, neighbors started taking sides. Some agreed, others defended me, pointing out that the blocks were on my private land. The thread grew heated, and people were arguing without knowing the full story. I watched it unfold from my kitchen table, feeling my chest tighten. Constance was not just threatening me anymore. She was turning the entire community against me. This was an escalation at a new level. She was attacking my reputation, making sure that even if I won legally, I would lose socially. I took screenshots of the entire thread and added them to my binder. Then I did something I had been avoiding. I filed a public records request with the county for any financial disclosures filed by HOA board members in the past 2 years. The county clerk told me it would take 10 business days to process. I thanked her and waited. On day 9, the envelope arrived. It was thick, stuffed with photocopied forms and tax documents. I sat down at my kitchen table and started reading. Most of the disclosures were routine. Board members reported their home addresses, their membership fees, minor reimbursements for office supplies. Nothing unusual. But when I got to Constance's section, something was missing. There was no disclosure for the road expansion project, no mention of the developer, no acknowledgement of any financial interest or consulting agreement. According to the bylaws, Any board member who failed to disclose a financial interest within 30 days of the first negotiation was in direct violation of fiduciary duty. The first email between the HOA and the developer was dated 6 months ago. She had never filed anything. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. This was it. She had not just promised access to my land without permission. She had done it while hiding a financial relationship with the people who stood to profit. That was not just unethical. It was grounds for removal. I made 3 copies of everything. 1 for my records, 1 for the HOA board secretary, 1 for the county housing authority. I mailed the 2nd and 3rd copies with tracking numbers and kept the receipts. Then I turned my attention to the upcoming meeting. It was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Thursday, 2 weeks away. I had already requested speaking time, and the board secretary had confirmed my slot. Now I needed to plan exactly what I was going to say. I could not afford to be emotional. I could not afford to ramble. I needed to present the facts in a way that was clear, undeniable, and impossible to dismiss. I wrote out a script and practiced it until the words felt natural. I wanted to sound calm, not angry, confident, not defensive, like someone who had nothing to hide because I had nothing to hide. 3 days before the meeting, Constance made her final mistake. I received another letter, this time directly from her on HOA letterhead. It was short, just 2 paragraphs. It stated that due to ongoing disputes and concerns raised by multiple residents, the HOA board was formally recommending that I remove the concrete structures from my property within 7 days to restore community harmony. Failure to comply would result in a formal complaint being filed with the county zoning office and potential legal action for creating a public nuisance. I read it twice, then smiled for the first time in weeks. She had just put the HOA board on record as taking action against me for something they had no authority over. She had overstepped, and she had done it in writing. I added the letter to my binder and marked it with a red tab. This was the final piece, the night before the meeting. I could barely sleep. I kept running through the presentation in my head, imagining how Constance would react, how the other board members would respond, how the neighbors would take it all in. I thought about the concrete blocks sitting outside, immovable and silent, a physical reminder that some lines could not be crossed. I thought about the weeks of parking on my lawn, the threats, the lies, the manipulation, and I thought about the moment, tomorrow night, when everything would finally be out in the open. I did not know how it would end, but I knew one thing for certain by the time I finished speaking. Everyone in that room would know exactly who Constance Fairchild was and what she had done. The blocks had stopped her car. Now the truth would stop everything else. The community center was packed. I arrived at 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes early, and every seat in the main room was already taken. People lined the walls, some holding coffee cups, others whispering to their neighbors. I recognized faces from down the street, people I had waved to in passing but never really spoken with. The energy in the room felt tense, like everyone knew something big was about to happen, but no one was sure what. I took a seat near the back and set my binder on my lap. My hands were steady, but my heart was pounding. At 7 p.m. sharp, Constance called the meeting to order. She sat at the head table with 4 other board members, all of them looking calm and composed. She did not look at me once. The first 20 minutes were routine business, budget updates, landscaping schedules, a proposal to repaint the community mailboxes. People asked questions, the board answered, and everything moved along like clockwork. Then Constance cleared her throat and looked down at her notes. "We have one resident request for public comment tonight," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. 5 minutes on the topic of property disputes. She paused, then looked up and scanned the room until her eyes landed on me. "You can come forward now," she said. I stood, picked up my binder, and walked to the front of the room. Every eye in the place followed me. I set the binder on the podium, opened it to the first tab, and took a breath. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak," I said. My voice was calm, maybe calmer than I felt. "I am here tonight to address a pattern of behavior by this board that violates HOA bylaws, exceeds legal authority, and puts the integrity of this organization at risk." The room went silent. I could see Constance's face tighten, but she did not interrupt. I turned to the first page in my binder and held it up so everyone could see. 3 weeks ago, I received this letter from the HOA threatening me with fines for lawn damage, I said. The damage was caused by repeated trespassing on my property by the board president herself, who parked her vehicle on my lawn every morning for 8 consecutive days. I flipped to the next tab. Here are photographs documenting the damage. Here is my certified property deed, which shows that my land is not subject to HOA jurisdiction. It was grandfathered in before the subdivision was created in 2003. I held up the county survey. This document, certified by the county clerk, confirms that fact. Murmurs rippled through the audience. People were leaning forward now, whispering to each other. I kept going. After I asked the board president to stop trespassing. She escalated, I said. She sent me a second letter threatening legal action. She hired a lawyer using HOA funds to intimidate me into compliance with rules that do not apply to my property. I pulled out the lawyer's letter and held it up. This letter cost the HOA $47,300 in legal fees, paid from the community budget without a vote or disclosure to the membership. Gasps spread across the room. One of the other board members looked at Constance sharply, and she stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched. I turned to the next section. But the real issue is not the trespassing or the misuse of funds, I said. The real issue is why she was parking on my property in the first place. I pulled out the development proposal and the email thread. 6 months ago, a private developer approached the HOA about a road expansion project. The project requires access to a survey point located on my property. In emails obtained through public records, the board president promised the developer that access was secured, even though she never asked for my permission and had no legal authority to grant it. I held up the email with her response highlighted in yellow. Access secured. No issues anticipated. I read aloud. The room erupted. People were talking over each other. Some standing up, some pointing at the board table. Constance raised her hand. That is taken out of context, she said, her voice sharp. I was facilitating communication between the county and private stakeholders for the benefit of the community. I shook my head. Then why did you not disclose your financial interest in the project? I said. I pulled out the public records request results. According to HOA bylaws, any board member with a financial interest in a project affecting the community must file a disclosure within 30 days. You have been in communication with this developer for 6 months. You filed nothing. That is a direct violation of fiduciary duty under Section 9.2 of the bylaws. Her face went pale. One of the other board members stood up. Is this true? He asked, looking at Constance. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She had no answer. I turned back to the audience. The board president used her position to grant unauthorized access to my property, misused community funds to threaten me when I resisted, and hid a financial relationship with a private developer, I said. She violated the bylaws, she exceeded her authority, and she did it all in writing. I held up the final letter, the one recommending I remove the concrete blocks. 3 days ago, she sent this letter on behalf of the HOA board, demanding that I remove structures from my own property that is not under HOA jurisdiction. She put the board on record, taking action it has no legal right to take. I closed the binder. I am not here to ask for an apology. I am here to ask that this board remove her from her position immediately, investigate the misuse of funds, and ensure this never happens again. The room exploded into applause. Not everyone, but enough. People were standing, clapping, shouting questions at the board table. Constance sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table. One of the other board members motioned for silence. We need to vote, he said. I move to suspend the board president pending a full investigation into these allegations. Another board member seconded. The vote was 4-1. Constance was the only one who voted against her own suspension. The room erupted again, this time louder. People were cheering. A few were shaking my hand as I walked back to my seat. Constance stood up slowly, her face blank, and walked out of the room without a word. I watched her go, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift. It was not over yet. There would be investigations, paperwork, maybe more lawyers, but the truth was out. The entire community knew, and the concrete blocks were still sitting in my yard, exactly where they belonged. The investigation took 6 weeks. The county housing authority sent an auditor to review the HOA's financial records, and what they found was worse than I had expected. Constance had not just misused funds for the lawyer's letter. She had also authorized payments totaling $47,300 over the course of 18 months for legal consultations, site visits, and administrative fees related to the road expansion project. None of it had been disclosed to the membership. None of it had been voted on. The auditor's report was 11 pages long, and it concluded that she had violated multiple sections of the state's nonprofit corporation code, including fiduciary duty, financial disclosure requirements, and proper use of association funds. The report was made public at the next monthly meeting, and this time, I did not have to say a word. The numbers spoke for themselves. 2 weeks after the audit was completed, the county issued its formal decision. Constance Fairchild was permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in the state for a period of 10 years, as outlined in Section 502.6 of the State Housing Code. She was also required to repay the $47,300 in misused funds within 90 days, with interest calculated at 6% per annum if she failed to repay. The county would place a lien on her property. The developer, for their part, quietly withdrew the road expansion proposal. Without access to the survey point on my property, the project was no longer viable. The email thread I had uncovered had made it clear that the entire plan had been built on the assumption that my land would be available, either through coercion or legal pressure. When that assumption collapsed, so did the deal. The developer moved on to another project in another county. Constance lost her anticipated commission, which I later learned had been structured as a consulting fee worth approximately $180,000. The social consequences came faster than the legal ones. Within 3 weeks of the meeting, Constance stopped attending community events. Her name disappeared from the neighborhood message boards. People who had once defended her began quietly distancing themselves. I heard from a neighbor that she had put her house on the market. 6 months later, she moved to another town, 50 miles away. I never saw her again. The new board president, a retired teacher who had been on the board for years but never held the top position, sent me a formal apology on behalf of the HOA. The letter acknowledged that the previous administration had exceeded its authority, misused funds, and caused harm to a member of the community. It was not a legal admission of liability, but it was something. It was recognition. The letter also included a check for $1,200, reimbursing me for the cost of the concrete blocks. I had not asked for it, but I accepted it. The concrete blocks are still there. I planted wildflowers around the base of each one in the spring, and by summer, they had grown into a border of color that softened the gray edges. Neighbors stopped asking about them. Some even complimented the landscaping. The blocks became part of the scenery, no longer a symbol of conflict, but a quiet reminder that boundaries matter. I think about that sometimes when I sit on my porch in the evenings, looking out at the lawn I spent so long maintaining. I think about how easy it would have been to let it go, to move the blocks, to avoid the fight. But I also think about what I would have lost, not just the land, not just the principle, but the proof that standing your ground, even when it feels impossible, can actually work. The system is not perfect. It is slow, it is frustrating. It requires patience and documentation and a level of persistence that most people do not have the energy for. But it exists, and when you use it correctly, it works. I learned a lot during those months. I learned that power without accountability always overreaches eventually. I learned that people in positions of authority often believe their own justifications, even when the facts prove otherwise. I learned that transparency is the only real defense against abuse, and that silence protects the wrong people. Most importantly, I learned that you do not need to be loud to be heard. You just need to be prepared. You need evidence. You need a process. You need to show up when it matters and let the truth do the rest. Constance thought she could intimidate me into giving up. She thought her title gave her the right to ignore boundaries. She thought wrong, and in the end, it was not anger or revenge that stopped her. It was documentation. It was bylaws. It was public records. It was a room full of neighbors who finally saw the truth laid out in front of them. That is how justice works, not with a bang, but with a binder. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that standing up for yourself is not just about being right. It is about being strategic. It is about knowing your rights and using the systems that exist to protect them. If you are dealing with someone who thinks they can bully you into submission, remember this: they are counting on you to give up. Do not give them that satisfaction. Document everything. Learn the rules. Show up when it counts. And if my story helped you in any way, or if you just enjoyed watching someone get exactly what they deserved, I would appreciate it if you subscribe to Karma Clause. This channel is all about real stories of accountability, justice, and people who thought they were untouchable until they were not. Hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what you would have done in my situation. Thanks again, and I will see you in the next one.